Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
Namaste. Okay, folks, this is our 7 p.m. show starting at about 7:50. So sorry for the delay. There were some compelling reasons, and I do not define compelling reasons because our liberals also do not define what compelling reasons force them to be most illiberal while they profess themselves to be liberals. And I've got Ruchir Sharma with me. Straight from Switzerland, is it?
Yes.
Yes. So, which one? Geneva?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, so the Geneva man is here. And do not be surprised by his appearance. He keeps changing his appearance all the time. So, why do all illiberals masquerade as liberals these days?
So is that the opening question?
Yes, that's the opening question.
It goes basically to the origins of liberalism. That liberalism is an ideology that was designed to transition a society from monarchy to a bourgeoisie-led form of governance, but then keep it that way and protect it from any further revolutionary or change tendencies. So in our case, we have transitioned from the British Raj into bourgeois democracy. So now liberals have achieved their end goal. Society has achieved perfection. And so now they take a defensive posture to protect the society, the constitution, the state that they've created for themselves from any attempt at social, political, economic transformation, because it works for them, and that's in their self-interest.
Okay, so that's how the Nehruvian secularism and the Nehruvian socialism, all that seems to go very well with the liberal idea of democracy in the Indian context, and of course with dollops of ahimsa, and then you've achieved what you have. Whereas I think you remarked in one of your tweets that this ahimsa business is great because it worked for the British and not really for the people who fought for it.
Yes. So nonviolent protest is generally the kind of protest that the establishment likes to encourage because it's very convenient. You can conveniently ignore it. You can conveniently manage it. It's a way to take the passions of the people, of the masses, who might want liberty, they might want independence, they might want to change the state to reflect their values. But if you tell them, oh, there's this good way to protest and there's this bad way to protest. If you protest the right way, this non-violent way, then you might get a reward. If you protest the wrong way, then you'll get punished. Using this carrot and stick, the Indian National Congress during the independence movement acted as a safety valve. That it took the mass movement that wanted independence, that wanted freedom, and channeled it into a form of protest, into a form of independence movement that was acceptable to the British Raj. And by doing so, what they did was they negotiated a moral victory for both sides. They were not pushing, a maximalist position saying that, we want independence on our terms. They were saying, please give us first, please give us dominion status. Then, oh, please give us independence. Look, we supported you in the First World War like a good colony. Please give us equal status to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, South Africa. But when the other party is not negotiating in good faith, that is not an effective mass movement. It's a very top-down attempt at harnessing the power of the masses and then using them to get concessions. And in the end, that's what our national movement was. It was a negotiation wherein the British Raj agreed to exit honorably, unlike in Algeria or Vietnam, where the locals kicked them out, or Indonesia, where the Japanese kicked out the Dutch. But it offered an honorable exit for the British, and it provided a power transfer from one British elite to a new native elite who are still, British educated lawyers and bureaucrats. So that shows that it's not necessarily it was not necessarily the intention of the leaders of the independence movement, or the ones we see to be the leaders, to get Sampurn Swarajya at the time, but rather to manage it, manage a soft independence. On the other hand, we had another negotiating party during the independence negotiations, and that was Jinnah's Muslim League. Now, they did not believe in ahimsa. They believed in the veto through violence. And they were very capable of mobilizing asymmetrical violence against civilians, against the state, through mob violence. Now, they also got independence one day before India. Now, they don't have this foundational myth that, we got independence by begging for it, by, being nonviolent. It was this moral crusade. And then they saw that how good we were and granted us independence. They said, no, we took independence by force. We didn't want to live with the humiliation of being ruled by these inferior kafirs and infidels. And we used our strength to build our land of the pure. So, that punctures a hole in the whole ahimsa myth. And by perpetuating it, we're spitting on the memories of the people who died in partition, who died in famines, who died in the independence movement, who were jailed, who were tortured, who were beaten, who were shot at, by saying, ahimsa, nonviolence granted us independence. No, independence was built on the ashes of those who sacrificed their lives for it.
But the going myth is, दे दी हमें आज़ादी बिना खड़ग बिना ढाल. And thereby you have these apostles of non-violence. And you mentioned this also, the apostles of non-violence: Mahatma Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. And every time a country like India asserts itself, or a country like South Africa asserts itself, then the ruling superpower, oblique superpowers, they actually tell you, look, your idiom is the Gandhian idiom or the Mandela idiom. How can you ask for a place on high table along with us? You think that is the global position?
The position is consistent. The position is that you don't deserve a place at the table with us. Any superpower, will always pursue its self-interest, and its self-interest is to protect its power. It doesn't want to share. It doesn't want new competitors. It doesn't want new rivals. So it embraces every policy that is effective in preventing the rise of other countries. Now, in the case of India or South Africa, they have a very useful soft tool, and that's saying, you're the country of Gandhi, you're the country of Mandela. You have a certain standard to uphold. And this is what another great independent thinker on Twitter calls the bigotry of high expectations, that they expect certain countries to behave to a higher moral standard because of historical reasons, whereas states don't have morality. Every state is equal in international law. Every state is equal at the UN. There's no such thing as a moral state, an immoral state, and all states are held to the same standards. So it's bizarre to say that, because you gained independence or you ended apartheid through a certain way, now your hands are tied in foreign policy, your hands are tied in domestic policy. Every other country has the right to moralize on your behalf. Whereas the whole point of independence or ending apartheid is that the common people's values should be reflected in the government, that they didn't want foreign rule, they didn't want foreign interference, and wanted to build a state that matches their aspirations and their values.
That is how earlier they used to say that, okay, that the church used to uh, give the cards, they used to give the certificates of civilized oblique uncivilized, and now you have only the roles have changed, the certificates have changed, but yes, certificates are still sought and got. You're muted.
Unfortunately, we have fallen into this trap of seeking certificates and seeking validation and seeking approval, which again comes back to the way that the Indian state was formed after independence. That at the time, there weren't many other examples of post-colonial countries. Latin America had some, but was still very much in the sphere of influence of the US. So basically, there was semi-colonies of the US instead of full colonies of Spain and Portugal. But at the time, in 1947, when we got independence, and 1950, when we got our constitution, the idea was that to be modern is to be like a Western nation state. And there was this need that was felt by the framers of the constitution and the doyens of our first government to adopt everything that would make us accepted as a legitimate modern sovereign nation state equal to a Western one. Now, the issue is, were the Western countries willing to accept us as equals in the first place? Are we playing this game without understanding the rules? And that's where realism comes in international relations or foreign policy. And that's a lesson that we never really learned. We didn't adopt a Chanakyan approach to foreign policy based on realism, but rather on morality and Panchsheel and ahimsa, which did not really get us any certificates or any brownie points. It just got the reputation of a soft state.
Exactly. I think we must be the only country of this size, or not even this size. I think even a tenth of our size, whose first prime minister actually said that India did not need a military, and I think that would have given the signal to all our so-called certificate givers to size us up completely, and that's how they treated us, with contempt.
Absolutely. And it's one thing to to project your moral force on the global stage, if you have something to base it on, if you have a unique polity, if you have the strength of a civilizational state, if you have achieved wonders in lifting your people out of poverty and giving them dignity and self-respect, then it means something when you project your values and your morality abroad. But without that, you look like, it's a poor country. It can't, feed its people. It can't give them a roof over their heads. It can't give them clothes on their back. But then they come and they to the UN and they talk about Panchsheel this and ahimsa that, and that's not to be taken seriously. Even during our non-aligned days, if we look at other neutral and non-aligned countries, the successful neutral countries are Switzerland, Austria, Finland, Sweden. Why are they successful and not countries like Belgium, which was once neutral, the Netherlands, Norway, Denmark? It's because a successfully neutral state is an armed neutral state. Armed neutrality gives you the ability to protect your sovereignty and protect your neutrality. So nonviolence, doesn't mean you just talk about, nonviolence is very desirable, peace is very desirable. You need to have the ability to inflict violence, but then choose not to use it. And that's the difference between a country like Switzerland or Sweden, which they were non-aligned. Well, they were neutral during the world wars. They were neutral during the Cold War, but they were still able to express an independent line of thinking in international affairs. We tried that, but did not have the hard power to back up this sort of soft power. And our friends within the non-aligned movement suffered even worse fates. So the founding nations of the non-aligned movement and the leaders there, we had Indonesia with Sukarno. Within a few years of starting the non-aligned movement, he was removed in a CIA coup d'etat and replaced by a military dictator. We had Abdul Gamal Nasser from Egypt, who was well, he inflicted a great humiliation on Britain and France with the Suez Canal nationalization, and they never forgave him for that. They bogged down Egypt's army in what was called Egypt's Vietnam, so in Yemen, where they fought Saudi-backed troops, which basically shattered Egypt's military, foreign policy, state capacity, and led to Nasser's replacement by Anwar Sadat, who was a pro-American. And then you had Tito of Yugoslavia, who, while he lived, was very well respected. And the US was very happy to pump money into Yugoslavia as this one renegade socialist country in Europe that was not in the Soviet bloc, that was trading with both sides, that allowed its people to travel. But once Tito passed away in 1980, for the next 10 years, they said, oh, look, we've invested so much in your country and your government, it's time to pay us back. And they were very harsh in demanding repayment, leading to stagnation, economic stagnation, leading to inflation. And then what happened? They started telling separatist groups that, look, there are these poor farmers in Bosnia and Macedonia, and they suck up all the money, and there's highways and malls being built in the capital, but the factories are here in Croatia, the factories are here in Slovenia. If you declared independence, the US and West Germany will recognize you, and you don't have to pay the debt. The debt belongs to the capital. And that fomented the breakup of the country. So it's very nice to have some sort of moral force projection, but it means nothing if you can't defend your values at home.
Do you think something similar is being done to India right now? The liberal United States, which basically professes liberal values but projects war everywhere?
Well, the reason it projects liberal values is because liberalism as an ideology is about protecting the status quo. It's about those who have social, economic capital, creating a system that works for them, and then restricting access to it so that they keep the keys to this safe. That applies to domestic politics, it applies to geopolitics. So they use liberal values, they use democratization or democracy promotion as foreign policy tools. They use it all around the world. They use it in Latin America. They've used it in Venezuela. In recent years, they've used it in Ecuador. They've used it in Asia as well, traditionally. And in Africa, you have the French playing a very similar role. And within India, let's look at India from the perspective of a superpower. So a superpower can only see the world as three kinds of countries. One, client states. So a country that is completely embedded in that superpower's sphere of influence. It does what is expected of it economically, politically, militarily. Then you have potential client states. A country that maybe with a bit of encouragement, with the right party winning the elections, could become a very loyal and reliable client state. And then you have rogue states, irredeemable states that can't be saved, will never be won over. So, for example, Russia or Iran, North Korea, Venezuela, they've written them off. That these will not be reliable client states. Now, where does India fit in that? we're definitely not a client state. We were always non-aligned, and even during non-alignment, we were closer to the Soviet Union. As a potential client state, some of the pro-India voices in the US, in the Anglo sphere in general, the most generous they can be is say, yes, maybe India can be a client state one day if it behaves, if it meets certain expectations. But within the foreign policy establishment, the consensus for decades has been that India is too big, too poor, too diverse, too chaotic to ever be a client state. And the best bet is to fragment it. If you turn it into 7 smaller countries and 2 of them become loyal client states and maybe 3 become potential client states, that's a great outcome for them. They got what they wanted. They get a nice loyal ally. They get some buffer states. From a superpower's perspective, that's more important than the sovereignty of some poor country that can't even defend itself. So of course, yeah, they have used this template before very successfully with Yugoslavia. Same issues there. That it was moral power, non-aligned, but very socialist, secular, federalized. That just made it easier to break it up. And now they have 2 countries out of the former Yugoslavia are now in the EU and are now in NATO. And the rest, if they're chaotic, if they're dysfunctional, that's their problem.
Okay, right. And where does that place China from the perspective of the superpower? How did they get trapped into China? Out of greed? Because certainly it wasn't going to be a client state. It wasn't a potential client state either. Somebody really goofed up thinking that it could be a client state.
Yes, with China, the US, they embraced China as an alternative to the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. So people have this misconception that that communism is the same in every country, but it generally takes on unique national characteristics to each country that it's in. So Soviet communism was different to Chinese communism, which was different to Vietnamese communism. And in the 60s, there was the famous Sino-Soviet split, where the 2 countries had a massive falling out in their interpretations of what communism and socialism are. And there were even border skirmishes between the 2 countries. Since then, the US began to wonder if China could be used as a buffer state against the Soviet Union, as a friendly communist country. And they opened relations with them. They started investing in the countries opening up. And then once the Cold War ended, the US and its intellectuals and its foreign policy elite thought that they had won the Cold War because their values were superior, which is not the case. They didn't even win the World War. The other side stopped competing because it was economically fruitless to try and catch up with the US's military and economic capacity. But they have this misconception that they won the Cold War because their values were superior. People like Francis Fukuyama started writing books on the end of history, that history has ended. History was this march of civilization, and we achieved perfection in 1992. Nothing needs to change. And this is a problem for developing countries like India or in Africa and Latin America, because we haven't achieved perfection. People still live in poverty, degradation, and their aspiration is to lift themselves out of it. The country's aspiration should be to reclaim its place as a major power. So defending the status quo is not in our self-interest. But continuing with this logic that they won the Cold War because of their superior values, they thought that if we expose China to more and more capitalism, capitalism leads to democracy and leads to liberal values, that as people get richer, they will discover the luxury of liberal values and start demanding the Chinese government to reform, not just economically, but politically. Now, that hasn't happened because the Chinese social contract is very different. It's based on Chinese values, on Confucian values. And this is something that Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore talked about as well. He used to talk about Asian values. There's a very famous declaration, the Bangkok Declaration, 1993, which was signed by almost all Asian countries, which talked about how the Western conception of liberal rights, individual rights, human rights are not universal, and that Asian countries have a different approach to it. That where collectivist societies, not individual societies, that rights don't exist in isolation in a vacuum. You can't enforce rights without the power to enforce them. So sovereignty comes first, and when you have a sovereign state, you have the ability to set the law and enforce the law, and rights result from that state capacity. So the Chinese social contract is that if you sacrifice a bit of individual freedom, the state will ensure that every next generation of your family will live a better life. It'll lift you out of poverty, it'll take the country back to its rightful place as the Asian superpower after what they call the century of humiliation. So China was not fully colonized like us, but they were colonized through opium wars, through flooding the country with opium, through forcefully opening up their ports, by disintegrating and weakening their empire, turning it into warring states. And that's something that they haven't forgotten. And they have a very long-term understanding of history and of the future, and are planning for what China will look like 100 years from now, 200 years from now, and taking the steps needed for that.
Okay, so how do you look at this, I should say, incestuous relationship between the various isms that are sprouting in the United States and the West? Of course, you have the liberalism, that is the overarching umbrella. Then you have Islamism, and the liberals and Islamists seem to get together very well in spite of the extreme illiberal values that Islam professes. Then you have something called wokism, which is an offshoot of a combination of what is called the cultural Marxism and postmodernism and things, the identity play that goes on. And of course, you very much have the what is called the classical socialism, which seems to have and of course secularism. I cannot forget secularism. How can I forget secularism? Secularism is what should I say? It is the leitmotif of the Indian state, at least. So all these great values, they seem to fit in so well with the so-called, quote-unquote, liberal values. And I cannot for the life of me understand how anybody in the right frame of mind can even justify that.
So the issue there is that many people think that people are motivated by values or ideology, but what they are really motivated by is interests. And anything that helps achieve your goals, helps you further your interests, is a tool or a strategy that's worth embracing. Anything that acts as an obstacle to your goals is something to be discarded. And in this case, the Western, let's say, liberal establishment are very happy to make cynical alliances because it protects their self-interest. It protects the way things are, with certain countries being rich and stable based on keeping other countries poor and dependent and unstable. Now, in the past, these protectors of liberal values have very happily propped up right-wing dictators in Latin America. They've very happily destroyed secular Arab nationalist states in the Middle East to replace them with radical Islamist regimes. They have always demonstrated that it's not any shared values that count in foreign policy, but their interests and whoever can help them achieve that. Now, when we look at liberalism as an ideology, generally what they do is designed to make them feel good as at the individual level without causing any radical change. So, for example, when you look at wokism, what is wokism? That's the term that's used for intersectionality. About that there's alliances between the LGBT activists, between minority groups, between environmentalists, even if they might not have common interests. The fact that they're protesting, the fact that they want to change, binds them together. Now, what liberals want is they don't want that change. They don't actually want these groups to achieve any political change, but what they want is to manage these groups. And they manage it by appropriating their messaging and again acting as that safety valve, like the Indian National Congress during independence, where you take these groups and you make a big show of supporting them and say, yes, we're your allies. Yes, we stand up. Oh, yes, solidarity with your causes. And then they feel very warm inside that, yes, we have contributed, we demonstrated our allyship, we demonstrated our solidarity, we did it. Now don't ask for any real demands. And that's what it basically comes down to. And with liberalism as an ideology, let's say in India, where I don't think we have ever had a liberal party that advertises itself as such. So we don't have, a liberal political philosophy or ideology in our political system. And if we do have it in our intellectual sphere, it's very, very small. And it's the luxury of the rich, who, again, they want to feel better. They want a coping mechanism for what they see. They see state failures around them. They see poverty. They see inequality. They see a state that is not responsive to the people. But they also want to disassociate the fact that they created this state. And this is 70 years of accumulated failure. So then what do you do? And this is where there's a fantastic lecture by the Slovenian political philosopher Slavoj Žižek. It's called First as Tragedy, Then as Farce. It was delivered 10 years ago at the Royal Society in London. And in that, he talks about this. And he goes back even further in time to Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, in the 19th century, wrote an essay called The Soul of Man Under Socialism. And he said, it's much more easy to have sympathy with suffering than it is to have sympathy with thought. People find themselves surrounded by hideous poverty, by hideous ugliness, by hideous starvation, and it's inevitable that they should be strongly moved by this. Now, with admirable, although misdirected intentions, they very seriously and very sentimentally set themselves to the task of remedying these evils that they see. But the remedies do not cure the disease. They merely prolong it, because the remedies are part of the disease. They try to solve the problem of poverty by keeping the poor alive. You throw them a few crumbs so that they still live in poverty, and you're like, oh, I did a good thing. We are taking care of these poor people. They're so helpless. But that's not a solution. That's an aggravation of the difficulty. So Wilde says the proper aim of society is to try and reconstruct it on such a basis that poverty will be impossible. But these altruistic virtues have prevented the carrying out of this aim. He says the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves, and so prevented the horror of the system from being realized by those who suffered from it and understood by those who contemplated it. And that's the problem. In 150 years, this has not changed. That this bourgeois morality, this liberal morality, is still about feeling better in an unequal society rather than trying to change it. And it's the same thing in geopolitics, it's the same thing in domestic politics.
Now let's come to present situation in India.
Yes.
You've seen that there has been a political change since 2014. Now, many of us feel that even though there is a political change, but a lot of things are said that Nehru has been disowned by the establishment or the political establishment, let's say. But Nehruism lives on as strong as ever. And the Nehruvian values, like that false secularism, which actually meant that anti-majoritarianism, anti-majoritism, not majoritarianism, but anti-majoritism, pro-minoritism, and generally, unequal relationships everywhere, and thriving on the basis of certain more aggressive minority groups. So even though this particular government has come on the strength of what is essentially an awakening or some kind of a renaissance of the Hindu majority, but it doesn't seem to value that. Do you think any change has happened in the general Nehruism, Nehru construct?
Well, the issue is that these Nehruvian values have been embedded in our institutions. So the constitution, the judiciary, the bureaucracy, the police are all reflective of two things. One is that most of them are continuations of colonial era institutions from the British Raj. So they're not designed to be citizen oriented. They're not designed to reflect the values of the masses. They're designed to protect themselves, the institutions, and uphold those who are in power. So to protect power. So that's one element. The other is this, what I call secularizing mission. So the colonial rulers, colonial countries like England or France had something called a civilizing mission. So that's how they justified their misdeeds, that they were coming to Africa, they were coming to Asia to civilize these poor natives who were incapable of ruling themselves, incapable of modernity. And then when the same tools of this civilizing mission were passed on to the modern Indian state, they were recalibrated a bit by the Nehruvian consensus, if one can call it that, or specifically by Nehru himself. They were recalibrated to what I call a secularizing mission, where the state accepts the colonial allegations that, oh yes, these Indians, they are too backwards, their beliefs are regressive, and that's why they're poor. They're poor because of their culture. And it's our duty as the state to cure them of this disease. So what he instituted was a reformist Hindu state, wherein the state took upon itself to reform the laws around marriage, divorce, inheritance of the Hindu majority, but in the name of minority rights, refused to engage in reformism for the rest of society. So for Muslims or for Christians, and this was called out in Parliament by his own party members, by the opposition. They said that, oh, you've embarked on this very radical reform attempt at the personal laws of the majority community. When will you be trying that with all of society, with the minorities as well? And Nehru said, the Muslims are not ready yet. Now, what does that mean? Not ready. It's not like you did a big survey of the Hindu community to see if they were ready or not. Ready or not, you had the numbers in Parliament, you pushed through the legislation, you enforced it. Now, what is meant by that, the not ready, is that Nehru and the Congress of the time were traumatized by partition. They were traumatized by Direct Action Day. They were traumatized by the partition riots, and had seen the limits of state capacity. that India still has these colonial tools of government which do not give them the capacity to actually enforce rule of law at the grassroots. So even if they did pass these reformist measures, if they went to enforce them, they were afraid that mobs would attack the police, mobs would attack the courts, mobs would attack every branch of the state. So as a result, the state just washed their hands off it and have created this false secularism, which is rooted in cowardice. That you are traumatized by partition, by direct action day, by the Mopla rebellion, and now you use all of your state capacity to prevent or delay that sort of mob violence, rather than what a modern state does is to destroy the capacity of non-state actors from challenging the state, from attacking civilians, from attacking state institutions. Instead, they try to buy or just rent peace by giving concessions. But that's not a sustainable policy. At some point down the line, it just demonstrates that you're weak and can be bullied into giving concessions. Now, when we look at liberal values in India, or even if we look at the values of our preamble, so sovereign, secular, socialist, democratic republic, there's a lot of guardians of the constitution and guardians of these values who cry a lot that any change is such an attack on constitutional values. I would ask, do these values actually exist on the ground, or do they only exist on paper? Are we a sovereign country? Do we have the right to make our own laws and enforce them without foreign interference? No, because these same guardians, want to invite the world's media or other countries to interfere in our legislation, in our judiciary, in our implementation of law. So no, we're not sovereign. Are we secular? As in a secular state, individuals have the right to practice freedom of belief. But in India, the state gives different levels of rights based on your religious identity. So it's not individual rights, it's community rights. And some communities are designated as minorities and then get special rights, to administer their religious and educational institutions. So that's not secular. So we failed that test too. Socialist. A socialist country should be guaranteeing people a certain basic standard of living. They should have water to drink, food to eat, they should have a roof over their head, they should have clothes on their back. That has only started now. That for 70 years we did nothing about it, and it's only now that we're looking at last mile delivery, getting electricity to people's houses, or guaranteeing them housing or water, tapped water. So no, we're not a very good socialist state either. Democratic, yes, we have elections, but the Westminster system, is designed again, for wealthy countries like the UK and for Australia and Canada, where you're just voting for your feudal lord, you're voting for the Raja of your constituency once in 5 years, and then they're supposed to go sit in Parliament and represent you. But what actually happens is that they disappear, and then you beg them. Oh, you have this MPLAD fund. Please spend some on the constituency. That's just patronage. That's not real democracy. Real democracy is when people's aspirations, their values are reflected in Parliament. What we have instead is that you have this beautiful machine that takes the aspirations of the people. People want, X, Y, Z. They put it through their vote into one side of the machine, and what comes out, through Parliament, through the bureaucracy, through the judiciary, some super diluted version of that, which is acceptable to the establishment. So that leads to frustration. And then republic. A republic means you have an elected head of state. We have a president who is elected, yes, but not directly. And as a result, people don't feel that connect. They don't understand the process behind it. So our president is elected by an electoral college of all the MPs and all the MLAs in the country, but that's not seen as transparent. So maybe I would say semi-republic. So out of these 5 values, 0.5. We got 0.5 out of these 5. that's not worth preserving. That's worth reforming radically. I saw a great piece of news from Canada just 20 minutes ago, which was very emblematic of the kind of arguments we see from our own liberal commentariat in India, and that was let me pull it up. So there's a town called East York where there was a proposal from the government to take a car park in the center of the town and redevelop it into affordable housing for the homeless. Now, how did the liberals respond to that? How did the wealthy custodians of values respond to that? They protested that. They said, this car park, it's the heart of our community. How can you destroy it? How can you take it away from us? That car park is our constitution. It doesn't do anything for the masses. The masses want to build something on top of it. That will help them. That will help their dreams come true, help their aspirations come to life. And then you have some rich people coming and saying, no, the car park is so important. That's where our values are. And let me tell you something. If a car park is what the heart of your community is, that means your heart is made of cement, because a car park is made of cement and your hearts are made of cement. You don't care about poor people. You don't care about empowering them. You care about your own self-interest, and you adopt all of this rhetoric that makes you sound like you're very kind and you're very liberal and you're very sympathetic. But sympathy does not feed a starving family. What they need is empathy, not sympathy. So empathy for their situation so that you understand what they want and you stop standing in the way of them lifting themselves out of poverty, lifting themselves back into self-respect and dignity, using the tools they have. People are not poor because they're stupid. People are not poor because they deserve it. Countries are not poor because they deserve it. Countries are not poor because of their culture. People are poor, countries are poor because of structural reasons. And whoever defends the status quo is defending that system, because they benefit from certain people staying poor and them staying at the top of society or at the top of geopolitics. That is the primary motivation of all of this liberal virtue signaling. You want to feel good inside, you want to look like you're doing something, but without doing anything effective at the grassroots.
Okay, very well explained. I'll just, before we go into the question and answer round, let me request our viewers, please ask your questions to Ruchir Sharma. I think we have got another 2-3 minutes before we go into question and answer round. And I would also request all my viewers to please support our initiative, to like the video, to share the video, as also to press the bell icon. And let's ask Ruchir Sharma this, specifically in the Indian context. You've seen this, a new government since 2014. It definitely has gone beyond the stereotype in very many ways. It's gone beyond the stereotype in the strategic affair, like calling the nuclear bluff of Pakistan. Then, doing away with the Article 370. It has also gone beyond the stereotype in the area of true socialism, in the sense that actually, especially the Prime Minister directly, has been very, very sensitive to the needs of the poor, and something very, very meaningful has been done at the ground level. And that was the reason that he got elected the second time, and not what the liberals would like to have us believe, that he got back because of Hindu nationalism. That's so much of hogwash. In fact, the Hindu nationalists are rather upset with the way the government is working. How do you look at that?
So I think it's very easy to fall into the trap that, oh, the people are mindless sheep who got seduced by this monster and his monstrous ideology because they don't have any agency, they don't have any brains of themselves. He injected this virus into their blood and now they've become monsters overnight just like him. This is, what we saw around the Trump victory. This is what we saw as rationalizations for the 2014 election result in India, and as well as 2019. Now, that's a very simplistic and self-serving argument where they don't want to actually reflect on what they did wrong. It's not like the rules changed of elections. It's not like society was transformed overnight. It's the same system that we know and understand for decades. So you want to cover up your own failings, like the opposition did not do a good job at motivating voters, of selling them some sort of vision or dream, or they didn't have the credibility needed to deliver on their promises. Now, these are things that you can address if you acknowledge them and try to do something different next time. But it's much easier to just call the voters stupid. Oh, yeah, the voters are stupid. What do they know? They just get seduced by this ideology. It was always hidden inside them. What do we do? So now they've started looking for support from abroad for regime change, that now they have not experienced electoral success because they refuse to understand what motivates voters. That the masses who vote are not 5,000 Western influenced liberals in 5 cities. Those people, they might be very active in publishing, but even in their own constituencies, they can't elect someone who reflects Western or liberal values. The government of India and Parliament of India are elected by the poor masses, rural and urban. And if they have seen the government working for them, delivering on grassroots welfare, be it LPG, be it gas, be it water connections, be it housing, then that is a material difference in their lives that they are seeking to reward. That again, this is in their self-interest. That your virtue signaling or talking about liberal values means nothing to someone who doesn't have clean water, who doesn't have a home, who doesn't have electricity, who doesn't have access to education for their kids. Everyone wants to live a better life. Everything is built on a foundation of material prosperity, that they will have the ability to talk about their values or demand the government or parties reflect their values once they have certain fundamental economic security. And that's what's important, that creating a proto-welfare state or an effective welfare state instead of the leaky one that we had in the past is a very important part of state building. That we can only build strong state capacity when citizens have the ability to lift themselves up out of poverty using the knowledge they have, using the tools they have, without unnecessary barriers by this feudal socialist Nehruvian system that we had, but also by the government providing them the infrastructure they need to do so.
All right. And the parting question from my side, before we move into the question answer round from the audience. What do you think of these farm protests?
So in a democracy, people have the right to pursue their self-interest. Some people choose to exert their self-interest through parliament. Some feel that that's not an effective way, and mobilize street protests. Now, what we're seeing in today's scenario is that the ruling coalition has a large majority in parliament. And so the leading party, so the BJP, has 303 seats at the last elections. With its allies, it's about 340, 350. The next largest party in the opposition got 70 seats or so. So
50,
even if
to Congress and 89 to UPA.
Right. So that's not enough to block any legislation in parliament. So what is a more effective way? You create something called an extra parliamentary opposition. This is something that we've seen in other countries as well, that For example, in the 1960s and 70s in West Germany, there was what was called a grand coalition, where the center left and the center right, the Christian Democrats and the Social Democrats, made an alliance, and they controlled about 80 or 90% of the seats because the two biggest parties made a coalition. That meant the others did not really have any ability to stop legislation in parliament. They could give some speech, but it didn't add up to any numbers. So then a lot of interest groups and students especially started creating what they call the extra parliamentary opposition. So an opposition outside of parliament that sought to mobilize the media and youth to create a veto on the implementation of that legislation or of that policy at the grassroots. So that's what we're seeing now. We saw it with the anti-CAA movement, and now with the farmers' protests. It's a form of expressing their self-interest in a way that they feel is effective, and it has involved foreign influencers. It's involved allies and solidarity, as I was mentioning earlier, from abroad. But that does not necessarily translate into impact on legislation or on the executive's implementation of policy. The laws were passed, well, they were discussed for 20 years across three different prime ministers with all the stakeholders involved. Many parties included these same reforms in their manifestos. The farmers' unions were also consulted. They also expressed a desire for these reforms to take place. So, with this in mind, it was passed in parliament. It was signed by the president. It is the law, and the state is obliged to implement the law. Now, in a democratic country, if you have an issue with a specific law, there are many avenues you can take to repeal it. You can create public pressure for their repeal. You can, elect a party or an MP who will go and raise it in parliament and ask for it to be repealed. But at the end of the day, you need to have those numbers. At the moment, they don't. So you see demonstrative activism instead.
Okay. On that point, let us now move to the audience questions and answers.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.
All right, so I see one is
Okay,
from
so
Rahul.
is Swiss-style direct democracy possible in India?
So I would argue yes. Swiss-style direct democracy is a fantastic system of democracy because it empowers people to bring their values to the forefront when designing legislation or state policy. Now, in order to do that, we need a radical reorganization of the state. So we need reforms of the constitution.
I think we lost the link. It looks like we lost the link. Yeah. Just wait a while. Let's take other questions. Maybe I should be able to answer them. मार दे बिना खड़ग बिना ढाली नहीं, ढेला भर नमक भी बेचा था साबरमती के संत ने, तब अंग्रेज चिढ़ गए, ये सोचा कि अगर इस देश में रहे तो ये टकलू नमक खिलाकर हमको पागल कर देगा. ऐसा कुछ भी नहीं है. अंग्रेज़ों को तो सूट करता था ये सब. और जैसा बोलते हैं कि जो 1930 वाला जो आंदोलन हुआ था वो इसलिए हुआ था क्योंकि कांग्रेसियों ने महात्मा गांधी को थोड़ा गंभीरता से लेना बंद कर दिया था, तो उन्होंने कहा कि हम अपने को दिखाएंगे वही कि हम कितनी मजबूती से कांग्रेसियों को और इस देश को मोटिवेट कर सकते हैं, और इसलिए ये हुआ था, ना कि कोई अंग्रेज कोई ऐसा अत्याचार कर रहे थे। अंग्रेज तो वही कर रहे थे जो वो चाहते थे, और गांधी जी उनका सहयोग कर ही रहे थे। नोनिकांता कोइजम, धन्यवाद आपका निकांता जी।
All right, sorry about that. I think I
Yeah,
lost
we
my
lost it.
connection.
You were answering that question about Swiss democracy.
Yes.
In the
So
meantime,
for,
there was another question which was up my street, so I took that.
all right, fantastic.
We
So
leave you with
to
the original
Rahul,
question.
what was that?
The original question about the Swiss democracy.
Yes. So to Rahul's question about is Swiss-style direct democracy possible in India? Yes, it is. It's possible in every country, but it requires you to create a basic constitutional infrastructure for that and an administrative infrastructure for that. It wouldn't work well with the current system of a weak central government and then strong state governments. What we would need to do is dissolve the current states and upgrade 740 districts into cantons. I would call them janpads, to use the ancient term for democracy in India. So, let's say we take 740 districts in India and we turn them into janpads. Now, in these janpads, we can create a system wherein they have an executive council that's elected by the residents of that janpad. And rather than each of them having their own legislature, we don't need, more than one, core set of laws in the country. It's one nation, one law. Rather, you give each janpad the ability to collect signatures. Let's say they have an initiative. There's a policy, there's a law that they want to see brought to life. You collect, let's say, 5 lakh signatures saying that we want this law to be passed, and then you can have a referendum. So let's say every 6 months you collect all of these initiatives from the public, and whichever ones get above a certain threshold, let's say 5 lakh, or let's say 1 million signatures, then the state is obliged to run a referendum on it, and then everyone can vote yes or no on that topic. And you need a population majority, so in terms of numbers, so more than 50% of them should vote yes, and more than 50%, or more than, if you want to be very conservative, 67% of the janpad should vote for it. If it passes, then that becomes the law, and the parliament is obliged to draft a law that will bring that to life. Now, that's a very representative system because people can have different concerns. Not every party will agree with every voter 100% of the time. Each voter is an individual. Each of them has their own interests. Each of them has their own ideas. And this way, they have the ability to make their concerns and their ideas heard and bring it to a wider audience. I think that would be a fantastic reform for the future, that if a government comes to have a majority in both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha, it should try to institutionalize a system on these lines with safeguards, of course. You don't want radical separatism or the like to come up through this. These should not be initiatives that challenge the sovereignty of the nation or cause violence. But yes, a good democracy, a representative democracy, is one that allows people's voices to be heard. So then I see another question. Shall I take that?
Yeah, does any developed country in the world have a civil service system that selects bureaucrats based on a bachelor level degree, single exam plus interview?
Yes, the country that invented it, China. If you consider China to be a developed country now, which some institutions do, then the entire concept of the modern civil service exam originates from the Chinese imperial model. So for centuries, China has selected its bureaucrats based on a very grueling civil service examination system, which even today it still exists. For all of Mao's talk about destroying the old institutions or capturing institutions, they still have a civil service exam. Only now, you're asked questions about Maoist theory and Deng Xiaoping's approach as well. So you're still expected in China to demonstrate mastery of certain subjects in order to become a bureaucrat or a party functionary. Other countries, let's say Western countries, have generally abandoned the civil service examination system and instead have corporatized and professionalized their civil service, which would just have open hiring. They can have short-term contracts. You're not hired for life. You get a 1-year contract, 5-year contract for a specific role. You do that job, you exit. Or they even, in many countries, hire consultants from McKinsey and Boston Consulting Group to do what earlier the civil service used to do. So it's a bit of both. So there are developed countries that have this system, but those ones are the kind who are still developing. And the ones that have been developed for a while generally graduated away from the elite exam system towards a more open style of recruitment.
Okay, next. Are liberal values global versus conservative values?
So no values are global. There's no such thing as universal values or universal morality. This is where the Bangkok Declaration on Human Rights comes in from 1993, spearheaded by countries like Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, where they said that different countries have different value systems and different ways of upholding and protecting those values. So, even if we look at liberal versus conservative, that means different things in different countries. So, liberal in some countries, for example, liberal means a center-right ideology. So in Europe, or even in Australia, the Liberal Party is the center-right party. Whereas in the US, liberals, or Canada as well, liberals are considered the center-left party, but that's because they don't have any left anymore. During the Cold War, during McCarthyism, these countries don't have a classical social democratic center-left or a hard left either. So in the absence of any left, they think that liberals are the leftists of these countries. But what the US has is a center-right party and a hard right party. And that's all that's allowed in their Overton window, in their system. So the values are not universal, and the definitions, liberal, conservative, means completely different things. In India, for example, the people who call themselves liberals, they don't stand for individual rights. They don't stand for a free market. They don't stand for anything that classical liberalism represents. In fact, all they do is say that, oh, the Constitution is sacred, don't change it. In other countries, that's called a conservative. If you worship the Constitution and say, oh, it should never be changed, and the Constitution is perfect, and the geniuses who made the Constitution, they were visionaries with perfect minds, and anyone who challenges it is, a terrible person, then that's considered a conservative position, that, oh, the values of the Constitution are more important than the will of the people, and the people need to work harder to be more like the Constitution. So no, they're not universal. The values are not universal. The definitions are not universal. The terms are not universal.
I think that brings us to the end of this show. And thank you very much for just a minute. Sorry, this just got disconnected for a bit. What do you think of other Ruchir Sharma's ideas? What's that?
Oh, I think he means the other Ruchir Sharma who works at Morgan Stanley and writes quite from a different perspective to me, but on many of the same issues. You know, on the BRICS, on foreign policy, on Indian elections and the like. But yeah, I generally hold the opposite opinions to him. So he is embedded in the Western financial elite, and his opinions reflect that. Whereas my opinion is that elites should not drive policy, and rather the people should have the ability to express their democratic aspirations and bring them to life by a wide range of tools.
Okay, Arjun Sharma, Jai Hind sir, has today's liberalism being guided on Nazi principles within the cloak of democracy? That is, mobs is equal to brown shirts. Thank you.
So I would refrain from using the term Nazi or fascist for political opponents. It's overdone these days, and by overuse, it begins to lose its power and the unique place that the Nazi movement and the Holocaust have played in modern history. So, but to answer the question, is liberalism being guided on Nazi principles? No. Liberals try their best not to associate or find any commonalities with Nazi ideology. Nazi ideology is quite illiberal in nature, and was very quick. Before it turned on Jewish people or the Roma community or on the homosexual community in Nazi Germany, the regime first turned for the left and the center left. So the first people who were sent to the camps were social democrats and left party members within that society. So as a result, they have quite an antagonistic relationship and try their best not to overlap in any way.
Okay. Why does the so-called liberals insult nationalist people by calling them bhakts or Gomutra and whatnot?
Well, anytime you resort to using slurs or name calling in a political debate, it only betrays your own weakness. That politics is supposed to be the marketplace for ideas, where you discuss, your ideas, and you can have disagreements. It's India is a free country. There's 1.3 billion people. Everyone has the right to have their own opinion, to share that opinion, and it's very unlikely that everyone will share the same opinion all the time. There's a joke that what happens when you put three Indians in a lift? You get four opinions. So it's it's healthy in a democracy to share your ideas, to challenge your own thinking, to challenge other people's thinking. But when you resort to name calling or using insults, that shows that you're not interested in a healthy debate. You're not interested in engaging with the other side and listening to what they have to say, or even projecting what you have to say. It's very unconstructive. And you don't win over the other side by calling them that. All you do is you make them more defensive and um, more entrenched in their views. I remember meeting the former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis a few years ago at a political party meeting, where there was a leftist party member who asked him that, oh, in my neighborhood, many of my neighbors, they've started voting for this terrible Nazi party. What do I do? How do I stop this virus in my neighborhood? And he said that you should look at them not as irredeemable Nazis or irredeemable Bhakts or irredeemable, Congress dynasty fans, but rather look at them as your neighbors first. That, this is my neighbor. They have voted a certain way. It's only by understanding what motivates them that I can engage with them as a human being to another. So calling them names and writing them off that, oh, this person is irredeemable, he's a bhakt, or he's a Nazi, or he's a communist, how is that constructive? It just makes you feel a bit better that I called them a name and now they can't come back to that. But it's not going to win you an election. It's not going to win you any friends. It's not going to change anybody's mind. So it's a very weak strategy, and it comes from impotence. It comes from weakness.
Right. Okay. Do we have more questions? Yes, there's one, sir. Pranam to both. My questions for both of you. Do you think that Indians abroad at prominent positions, take such as Sundar Pichai, Satya Nadella, etc., suffer from the approval seeking from liberals problem as well? How deep is the problem in industry versus academia?
So these big tech CEOs like Sundar Pichai or Satya Nadella, they operate in a certain incentive structure. So they live and work in the West. They operate a company that has to deal with the debates in those countries, that has to deal with the laws and norms of those countries. So, of course, they have every incentive to behave within those laws and to say the right things and do the right things to keep themselves on the good side of their consumers, of their financial backers, of the regulatory authorities. So these CEOs, they are US citizens running US companies. Obviously, they will act in the interests of those companies within the framework of US debates, US regulatory environments. For the second part of the question, is this more prevalent or is it more prevalent in industry or academia? It's much deeper in academia, because in academia, your career progress is tied to the approval of your peers. Now, if you want to get a good mark in your degree, let's say you're in, especially in humanities, let's say you're studying history, political science, South Asian studies, as it's called in some countries. You want to do well, you want to have a good career. What do you need to do? You need to impress your professors, you need to get good marks. At the end of that, you need to do a PhD, find a supervisor who is willing to accept your topic. So, there's already many levels of filtration happening there. Let's say you get your PhD topic approved, then you're guided a certain way by your PhD supervisor. It needs to be marked by 3 different professors. The other 2 you might not even meet. They might be in other countries. They might have very different academic opinions to you. So all of these incentives are designed to make sure you reinforce the existing corpus of knowledge. If you challenge it too much, you'll face a lot of pushback and you'll find a lot of obstacles in your career. So people, very few people are that strong that they want to constantly fight that system, it's easier to just sit back and go with it. And yeah, even in academia, after you do your PhD, what happens next? You need to do a postdoc. You need to get papers published. You need to get a teaching job. There aren't any teaching jobs anymore. So you take some ad hoc positions where you're completely at the mercy of your superiors. Just a second. You take some ad hoc positions. After a lot of bootlicking and a lot of following the rules, a lot of doing research that you're not even interested in, eventually maybe you'll get to be a lecturer or just a sec. You'll get to be a lecturer or an assistant professor, and then you want to be promoted. You still have to jump through those hoops every time. So there's a very strong incentive structure to say the right thing, to do the right thing within academia, and that's something that will only change once we have enough influence as a culture, as a civilization, as a state to project force in academia. That's something that China has been doing quite well in recent years and will continue to do well. It's something we can learn from them.
Okay, so anyway, this is how many PhDs should India generate per year? I think we are over time now, so you can just give a small answer to this.
That's hard to say. I can't give a number to how many PhDs India should generate because PhDs are about quality and not quantity. What's important is that the research coming out of India is high quality, that it provides value to our understanding of science, of technology, of humanities, of whichever topic, and it should be a pathway to innovation, to the decolonization of our minds, of our institutions, and a better understanding of our own knowledge systems. That at the moment there are these gatekeepers, often foreign gatekeepers, who decide what's acceptable as an opinion, what's unacceptable, and basically lock the door to our own knowledge traditions, our own heritage, and don't let anyone in. That's something that needs to be dismantled through high quality research, through high quality researchers, through motivated programs and targeted programs.
Okay. So that brings us to the end of this question answer session. Thank you all viewers, and thank you Ruchir. Thank you so much. I think we have had a wonderful discussion.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Yes.
These were great questions all around, and it was a pleasure to answer them.
Okay, so that brings us to the end of this, and Jai Hind, Vande Mataram.
Jai Hind.
Press the bell icon on YouTube and don't miss another update.